sound that stopped the British state in its tracks was not a siren, nor a shouted command, nor the tolling of a bell. It was the sharp, crystalline shatter of a Waterford glass slipping from the hand of the Queen Consort and striking the marble floor of the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. It happened at 8:14 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, during the annual diplomatic reception, an event attended by over 400 foreign ambassadors, high commissioners, and senior government ministers. One moment, Queen Camilla was standing near the Van Dyck portraits, speaking with the French ambassador, smiling, holding a glass of sparkling water. The next moment, her eyes lost focus, her hand went slack, the glass shattered, and she collapsed. She did not fall dramatically. She simply folded, her knees giving way, her body crumpling onto the polished marble with a sickening, heavy thud that echoed through the sudden, terrified silence of the gallery. The response of the Royalty Protection Command was instantaneous. Within 4 seconds, 2 protection officers were at her side. Within 12 seconds, the palace's resident medical officer, Dr. Michael Dixon, was sprinting down the corridor, his trauma bag in hand. Within 30 seconds, the gallery was cleared of all diplomatic guests, the heavy oak doors were sealed, and a secure perimeter was established. But the medical reality that unfolded on the floor of the picture gallery was not a simple fainting spell. It was not a momentary drop in blood pressure. Assessed the Queen Consort was erratic pulse, a profound neurological deficit on her left side, and a terrifying lack of responsiveness. He keyed his radio and spoke the 3 words that trigger the highest level of sovereign medical emergency. Code red, immediate. Within 8 minutes, an ambulance with its lights flashing but sirens muted was speeding through the gates of Buckingham Palace, carrying the Queen Consort to the intensive care unit at King Edward VII's Hospital in central London. And riding in the back of that ambulance, holding his wife's unconscious hand, was King Charles III. Before we reconstruct the devastating medical diagnosis that emerged from the hospital that night, before we walk through the unprecedented midnight emergency session of the Privy Council that fundamentally altered the line of succession, and before we describe the agonizing conversation in a hospital chapel where a father handed the crown to his son while his wife fought for her life, make sure to hit subscribe to and turn on the notification bell. Because this story is not about a medical emergency, it is about the ultimate, irreconcilable collision between the demands of the crown and the demands of the human heart. It is about a king who spent 50 years waiting for the throne, only to realize, in the span of a single, terrifying hour, that the throne was entirely worthless if it cost him the woman he loved. And it is about a son who was forced to take the crown not in a moment of solemn, planned succession, but in the chaotic, terrifying shadow of a hospital waiting room. To understand the magnitude of what happened that night, we must first understand the medical reality of Camilla's collapse. When she arrived at King Edward VII's hospital, she was immediately rushed into the neurocardiac trauma unit. The initial scans and diagnostics revealed a severe, acute event, a complex cardiovascular incident that had triggered a transient ischemic cascade. In layman's terms, a massive disruption of blood flow that had simultaneously stressed her heart and starved her brain of oxygen. It was not a fatal stroke, but it was a profound, life-altering warning. The attending specialists, joined by the top neurologists and cardiologists from Harley Street, delivered their preliminary prognosis to the king at 11:30 p.m. The prognosis was stark. The Queen Consort would survive. But the recovery would be long, arduous, and entirely incompatible with the physical and psychological demands of being a working royal. She would require months of intensive rehabilitation. She would need to be shielded from stress, from public scrutiny, from the relentless grinding machinery of the royal schedule. She needed, above all else, peace. She needed her husband, and it was in that moment, standing in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of the hospital, listening to the doctors explain that his wife's nervous system was fundamentally compromised, that something inside King Charles III quietly, permanently broke. Not his spirit, not his love, but his willingness to serve the crown at the expense of his life. Charles has spent his entire adult life sublimating his personal desires to the demands of the institution. He gave up the woman he loved in the 1970s because the institution deemed her unsuitable. He endured a loveless, disastrous marriage to Diana because the institution demanded an heir and a spare. He waited 73 years to become king, sacrificing his privacy, his autonomy, and his personal happiness on the altar of duty. But when he finally ascended the throne, he did so with Camilla by his side. She was his anchor. She was his confidant. She was the only person in the world who truly knew the weight he carried. And now, looking through the glass of the ICU door at her pale, still face, tethered to monitors and IV lines, Charles realized a terrifying truth. The crown is a jealous master. It demands everything. It demands your time, your energy, your public face, and your private soul. And if he remained king, the crown would demand that he leave this hospital. It would demand that he fly to state dinners, read cabinet papers, grant royal assent, and smile for the cameras while the woman he loved lay in a hospital bed. He could not do it. He would not do it. At 1 a.m., Charles summoned his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, to the hospital's private family waiting room. The room was quiet, smelling of antiseptic and stale coffee. Charles sat in a vinyl armchair, his tie loosened, his face grey with exhaustion. He did not pace. He did not weep. He looked at Sir Clive and spoke with a clarity that was absolute and chilling. "Clive," he said, "I am done. I cannot do this. I will not do this. The institution requires a king who is entirely present. I cannot be present. My place is here, in this room, beside her, until she is well. And if she is never entirely well, my place is beside her still. I am stepping down. Tonight." Sir Clive, a veteran courtier who has managed royal crises for decades, was stunned. He gently reminded the king of the constitutional impossibility of an impulsive abdication. He spoke of the Commonwealth realms. He spoke of the markets. He spoke of the geopolitical instability that a sudden vacuum at the head of state would cause. Charles listened, and then he said, "Then you must convene the Privy Council. You must draft the instruments. You must call the Prime Minister. You must call William. I am leaving the building, Clive. Make the legal machinery work." The legal machinery of abdication in the United Kingdom is not a simple matter of signing a resignation letter. It is governed by the His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act 1936, the very same legislative framework that was hastily constructed for Edward VIII. But Edward abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Charles was abdicating to sit by a hospital bed. The constitutional mechanism requires a formal instrument of abdication, signed by the sovereign, witnessed by key members of the Privy Council, and subsequently ratified by an Act of Parliament to ensure the succession passes cleanly to the heir. Furthermore, because the British monarch is the head of state of 14 other Commonwealth realms, the governments of those realms must be consulted and give their formal consent to the change in sovereignty. It is a massive, complex, bureaucratic undertaking that usually takes months of quiet preparation. Charles was demanding it be done in hours. By 2:30 am, the Prime Minister was awake and in a secure video link with the Lord Chancellor, the Attorney General and the Cabinet Secretary. The atmosphere in Whitehall was one of controlled panic. The Prime Minister, recognising the absolute finality in the King's voice as relayed by Sir Clive, understood that this was not a negotiation. The sovereign was invoking his prerogative to relinquish the crown. If the government resisted, if they tried to force him to stay for the sake of stability, they would trigger a constitutional crisis of unimaginable proportions. A king who refuses to reign is a paralysed state. The Prime Minister authorised the immediate drafting of the emergency legislation. The Lord Chancellor's office began drafting the Sovereign Transition and Abdication Bill. And at 3:15 am, a black convoy left Buckingham Palace and sped through the empty London streets toward King Edward VII's hospital. Inside the lead car was Prince William. William had been asleep at Adelaide Cottage when the call came. He was told only that his stepmother had suffered a severe medical event and that his father required his immediate presence at the hospital. He dressed in the dark, kissed a sleeping Catherine, and got into the car. He assumed he was going to the hospital to offer support, to manage the family, to help his father navigate the immediate medical crisis. He did not know that he was driving toward his own coronation. When William arrived at the hospital at 3:45 a.m., he was not taken to the ICU. He was taken to the hospital's small interdenominational chapel in the basement. The room was dimly lit by a few flickering electric candles. Charles was sitting in the front pew, staring at the simple wooden cross on the altar. William sat beside him. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sound was the distant, muffled hum of the hospital's ventilation. Finally, Charles turned to his son. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "William, she is stable, but she is broken. The doctors say she will need me, not the king, me, the man. And I cannot be the man if I am the king. The crown takes everything. It takes your mornings, your evenings, your mind, your heart. I have given it 75 years of my life. I have nothing left to give it, and I will not give it her. I am stepping down. The Privy Council is convening at dawn. The Prime Minister is drafting the bill. By tomorrow evening, you will be king." William stared at his father. The shock was physical. He felt the air leave his lungs. He had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, studying the constitutional law, learning the statecraft, shadowing the diplomats. But he had always assumed it would happen in the natural order of things, after a long reign, after a peaceful past. Not in the basement of a London hospital at 4 a.m., while his stepmother lay in an intensive care unit upstairs. "Dad," William said, his voice tight, "you are in shock. You are exhausted. This is trauma speaking. You cannot dismantle the monarchy in the middle of the night because of a medical emergency. We can invoke the Regency Act. I can act as Prince Regent. I can carry the burden while you stay here with her. You don't have to abdicate. You just have to step back." Charles shook his head slowly. "No, William. A regency is a pause. It is a waiting room. The country would be waiting for me to return. The institution would be in a state of suspended animation. The press would hound her hospital room, waiting for the king to emerge. The only way to protect her, the only way to give us the peace we need to heal, is to sever the tie completely, to make it permanent. I am not stepping back. I am stepping down. I am giving you the crown, and I am taking my wife." William looked at his father. He saw the profound, unshakable resolve in the older man's eye. He saw the man who had endured a lifetime of public mockery, a disastrous first marriage, and the agonizing wait for the throne, finally drawing a line in the sand. Charles was choosing love over duty. It was the exact opposite of what his great-uncle Edward VIII had done. Edward had abandoned his duty for a fleeting, selfish romance. Charles was abandoning his duty to fulfill a deeper, older, more profound vow. In sickness and in health, till death do us part. William realized with a heavy, settling sadness that he could not argue. To argue would be to ask his father to choose the institution over his wife. And William, looking at the man who had raised him, knew he had no right to make that demand. William nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, Dad. I will take it. I will do it. You stay here. I will go to the palace." At 6 a.m., the Privy Council convened in an emergency, closed-door session at Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere was surreal. The grand gilded council chamber was filled with the highest officers of state, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord President, and the Prime Minister, all of whom had been roused from their beds and rushed to the palace in the dark. The Lord President read the formal statement. His Majesty the King, due to profound personal and medical circumstances within his immediate family, has declared his irrevocable intention to abdicate the throne. The instrument of abdication, drafted by the Lord Chancellor, was placed on the table. Because Charles was not present at the palace, the instrument had been signed by him at the hospital at 5:15 am, witnessed by his private secretary and the hospital's chief medical officer, and transported under armed guard to the palace. Privy Council formally accepted the instrument. The Prime Minister then introduced the Emergency Sovereign Transition Bill, which had been fast-tracked through a virtual cabinet meeting and was ready for immediate royal assent. But there was a constitutional paradox. The king who needed to give royal assent to the bill that would end his reign was the very man stepping down. To resolve this, the Lord Chancellor invoked a rarely used constitutional convention. The outgoing sovereign signs the instrument of abdication, and the moment it is formally lodged with the Privy Council and the Accession Council is convened, the heir apparent immediately assumes the sovereign prerogative. William, now standing at the head of the table, signed the royal assent to the transition bill, not as the Prince of Wales, but as the sovereign. The legal transfer of power was complete. The crown had passed, not through the tolling of a death knell, but through the scratch of a fountain pen in a hospital room. At 10 a.m, the Accession Council met at St. James's Palace. This is the ancient ceremonial body that formally proclaims the new sovereign. Usually it is a sombre, highly choreographed event following the death of a monarch. Today, it was a rushed, deeply emotional and historically unprecedented gathering. William stood before the council, flanked by Catherine, who was now, by the instantaneous operation of common law, Queen Consort. William's face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and the immense psychological weight of the morning. He read the accession declaration, his voice steady but lacking the usual ceremonial resonance. He swore to uphold the Church of Scotland. He swore to serve the nation. But everyone in the room knew the unspoken context. He was taking the throne while his father still drew breath, while his stepmother lay in a hospital bed, and while the nation was entirely unaware of the crisis that had precipitated this moment. At 11 a.m, the Garter King of Arms stepped onto the proclamation gallery at St. James's Palace. The crowds gathered below, confused, having seen the sudden movement of royal vehicles and the breaking news alerts on their phones, but not knowing the reality. The Garter King of Arms unrolled the parchment and read the proclamation. Whereas His Majesty King Charles III has, by an instrument of abdication, relinquished the crown, the throne is thereby vacant. Therefore, we, the Lords Spiritual and Temporal, do now proclaim that Prince William Philip Arthur Louis is now King William V. The trumpets sounded. The crowds cheered, but the cheer was hesitant, confused, laced with anxiety. Where was King Charles? Was he dead? Was he ill? The palace had maintained a strict information blackout regarding Camilla's condition to protect her medical privacy. The public knew only that an abdication had occurred. The shockwaves rippled across the globe. Stock markets in London paused trading for 10 minutes as algorithms tried to process the constitutional anomaly. Foreign capitals scrambled to rewrite their diplomatic cables. The British monarchy had just executed the most sudden, unexpected transfer of power in 3 centuries. Back at King Edward VII's hospital, the news of the proclamation was brought to Charles by Sir Clive Alderton. Charles was sitting beside Camilla's bed. She was still heavily sedated, her breathing assisted by a ventilator, her face pale against the white pillows. Charles held her hand, gently stroking her knuckles with his thumb. Sir Clive entered the room quietly, holding a printed copy of the London Gazette, which had just published the official notice of the accession. "It is done, sir," Clive said softly, using the traditional address, but his tone was gentle, recognizing the shift in reality. "The proclamation has been read. William is king." Charles looked up from his wife's face. He looked at the newspaper. He nodded slowly. "Good," he whispered. "Good. Now close the door, Clive, and tell the protection officers outside that they are no longer guarding the sovereign. They are guarding a private citizen and his wife. I want the press pool moved back to the end of the street. I want the royal standard taken down from the roof. I want quiet." The stripping away of the royal apparatus from Charles and Camilla was immediate and total. This was Catherine's doing. Catherine, now Queen Catherine, understood that for Charles's abdication to be meaningful, and for Camilla to have any chance of a peaceful recovery, the suffocating machinery of the court had to be physically removed from the hospital. She issued a directive from Buckingham Palace at noon. All royal equerries, ladies-in-waiting and household staff attached to Charles and Camilla were to stand down from active hospital duty. The Royalty Protection Command was downgraded from a sovereign-level detail to a high-risk private detail. The royal standard was lowered from the hospital's flagpole and replaced with the standard Union Jack. The physical manifestation of the crown was removed from the room. When Charles looked out the window, he no longer saw the rigid, saluting guardsmen of the sovereign. He saw regular London police officers. He was no longer the king. He was just Charles, a 75-year-old man, terrified, exhausted, sitting beside the woman he loved, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. The medical reality of Camilla's condition over the next 72 hours was a grueling test of endurance. The neurological deficit on her left side required immediate, intensive physiotherapy. The cardiac stress required constant monitoring. She woke up on the second day, groggy, disoriented, and frightened. Rasped through throat was Charles.
He hadn't left.
He hadn't gone to the palace. He hadn't attended the emergency cabinet meetings. He had slept in a vinyl armchair in the corner of the ICU, eating hospital cafeteria sandwiches, washing his face in the staff restroom. When she saw him, she tried to smile, but the left side of her face wouldn't fully respond. "What happened?" she whispered. Charles leaned in, kissing her forehead. "You had a fall, my darling. A bad one. But you're... And I'm here." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, seeing the deep lines of exhaustion, the lack of a suit, the absence of the private secretary hovering in the background. "The palace?" she asked. "William has it," Charles said softly. "I gave it to him. It's his now. We are retired, my love. We are finally, truly retired." The tears that fell from Camilla's eyes were not tears of grief for the lost crown. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. For 50 years she had been the other woman, the villain of the tabloids, the interloper, the woman who had to fight for every inch of respectability, every inch of acceptance within the institution. When she finally became Queen Consort, she threw herself into the work, determined to prove her worth, determined to carry the burden with grace and dignity. But the burden was crushing. The relentless schedule, the constant scrutiny, the physical toll of standing for hours in heels, smiling until her face ached, carrying the weight of the monarchy's public image. And now, in a single terrifying medical event, it was all gone, taken away, not by her choice, but by her failing body. And the man she loved had looked at the ultimate prize, the crown of St. Edward, and thrown it away to hold her hand. "You gave it up," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For me." Charles smiled, a genuine soft smile that reached his eyes. "I gave it up for us. It was always supposed to be us, Camilla. Just us. Now it finally is." While the intimate human drama played out in the hospital room, King William V and Queen Catherine were forced to manage the colossal institutional fallout of the abdication. The transition was chaotic. The machinery of the state is designed to transition upon death, not upon a sudden, living resignation. William had to immediately assume the red boxes, the daily intelligence briefings, the prime ministerial audience. He moved his primary office from Kensington Palace to Buckingham Palace, a physical relocation that felt surreal and deeply uncomfortable. He was sitting at his father's desk, using his father's pens, while his father was 3 miles away in a hospital gown. The psychological dissonance was immense. William is a man of deep duty, a man who respects the hierarchy and the natural order of things. Taking the throne under these circumstances felt to him like a usurpation, even though it was entirely legal and entirely his father's wish. Catherine, recognizing her husband's psychological burden, stepped into the role of Queen Consort with a masterful, stabilizing authority. She managed the household transition, ensuring that George, Charlotte, and Louis were shielded from the chaos, explaining to them in age-appropriate terms that their grandfather had stepped down to take care of their grandmother, and that their father was now the king. She managed the media strategy, working with the palace communications team to craft a narrative that framed the abdication not as a crisis, but as a profound modern act of familial devotion. The palace released a carefully worded statement on the 3rd day. Following a severe medical event requiring intensive care, Queen Camilla is recovering. King Charles has determined that his absolute priority must be his wife's health and rehabilitation. Consequently, he has abdicated the throne to ensure the uninterrupted governance of the realm, passing the sovereign duties to King William V. The nation's gratitude for King Charles's lifetime of service is immeasurable, and the royal family asks for privacy as they support the Queen's recovery. The public reaction to the statement was extraordinary. For decades, the British public had viewed Charles and Camilla through a lens of cynicism, baggage, and historical gossip. They were the survivors of a messy public scandal. But the image of a king willingly surrendering the ultimate power, the ultimate prestige, simply to sit by his sick wife's bedside, struck a deep emotional chord with the public. It humanized the monarchy in a way that 1,000 carefully curated documentaries never could. It showed that beneath the velvet robes and the gold carriages, there were just people. People who loved each other, people who grew old, people whose bodies failed them.
The tabloids, which had spent 30 years tormenting Camilla, suddenly shifted their tone. The headlines became sympathetic, respectful, almost reverent.
"The King Who Chose Love," read the front page of The Sun.
"A crown relinquished, a vow kept," read the Times. The abdication, initially feared as a constitutional disaster, was rapidly transforming into a powerful modernizing legend for the House of Windsor. But the institutional reality was far more complex. The Commonwealth realms had to rapidly pass their own mirroring legislation to recognize William as their head of state. The diplomatic corps had to reaccredit their ambassadors. The military had to swear new oaths of allegiance to King William V. The Bank of England had to halt the production of Charles's profile for the new coinage and begin the redesign for William. The sheer bureaucratic momentum of the state had to be violently redirected. And William, sitting in the 1844 room at Buckingham Palace, felt the crushing weight of it all. He had expected to inherit a stable, well-oiled machine after a period of national mourning. Instead, he'd inherited a machine in the middle of a high-speed gear shift. He relied heavily on Catherine, whose strategic mind and calm demeanour became the anchor for the new regime. They operated as a true partnership, a dual executive, making decisions together, reviewing the red boxes together, presenting a united, unshakable front to a startled world. As the weeks turned into months, Camilla's recovery was slow, painful, and frustrating. The neurological damage was not entirely reversible. She would walk with a cane. Her left hand would never fully regain its fine motor skills. She would tire easily. The doctors were clear she could never return to the grueling schedule of a working royal. She was, effectively, permanently retired, and Charles embraced this reality with a fierce protective devotion. They moved out of Clarence House and retreated to Raymil House, their private residence on the Balmoral estate in Scotland. It was a deliberate choice, away from the glare of London, away from the press packs, away from the constant reminders of the life they had left behind. In Scotland, surrounded by the hills and the rivers, Charles found a peace he had never known.
He gardened. He painted. He read to Camilla in the evenings. He cooked simple meals. He became, for the first time in his life, entirely his own man. He was no longer the Prince of Wales. He was no longer the king. He was just Charles, and he was happy. King William, meanwhile, settled into the rhythms of sovereignty.
The transition, though abrupt, proved to be the catalyst the monarchy desperately needed. William, unburdened by the historical baggage of his father's generation, implemented a radically modernized, streamlined version of the court. He reduced the number of working royals. He centralized the communications. He focused the institution's efforts entirely on environmental initiatives, early childhood development, and modernizing the Commonwealth. The slimmed-down monarchy was no longer just a slogan. It was the operational reality. And the public, seeing a young, energetic, deeply focused king and queen, rallied behind the new regime. The abdication, which the old guard had feared would destroy the mystique of the crown, actually revitalized it. It proved that the monarchy was not a rigid, unthinking machine, but a living institution capable of profound human sacrifice. What does this story tell us about the monarchy? It tells us that the ultimate strength of the British crown lies not in its unyielding rigidity, but in its capacity for adaptation. For centuries, the mantra was, "The king is dead, long live the king." The transition was biological, inevitable, and absolute. But the abdication of Charles III proved that the transition can also be voluntary, moral, and deeply personal. It proved that the institution can survive the living departure of its sovereign. It showed that the monarchy is capable of recognizing when the human cost of duty becomes too high and choosing the human over the duty. This is a profoundly modern concept. It aligns the ancient institution with the modern values of mental health, familial devotion, and the recognition that no job, not even the crown, is worth the destruction of the self or the neglect of the ones you love. It tells us that Charles III, often criticized in his youth as petulant, indecisive, and overly emotional, achieved in his final act as king the most profound demonstration of strength imaginable. It takes immense courage to hold on to power. It takes a much rarer, much deeper courage to willingly let it go. Charles looked at the crown, the culmination of his entire life's ambition, and realized it was lighter than the hand of his wife. By walking away, he didn't diminish the monarchy. He elevated it. He showed that the sovereign is not a slave to the throne, but a steward of it, and that a steward must know when to pass the keys. His exit was not a failure, it was his greatest triumph. It was the ultimate vindication of his 50-year love story with Camilla. He finally gave her the ultimate proof of his devotion, a proof written not in tabloid apologies, but in the constitutional history of the United Kingdom. It tells us that William and Catherine are the exact leaders the monarchy needs for the 21st century. They did not panic. They did not resent the sudden burden. They absorbed the shock, managed the crisis, and stabilized the realm. William's willingness to step into the breach, to take the crown under the shadow of medical trauma, demonstrates a profound sense of duty that matches his father's sacrifice. Charles sacrificed the crown for love. William accepted the crown for duty. Together, those two actions form a perfect complementary circle of institutional survival. The father protected the family, the son protected the state, and Catherine, standing beside William, proved that she is not just a consort, but a co-pilot of the realm, possessing the strategic brilliance and the emotional intelligence required to navigate the most turbulent waters. The legacy of the midnight abdication will be studied by historians and constitutional lawyers for centuries. It will be the precedent that redefines the limits of sovereign power and the mechanics of succession. But more importantly, it will be remembered by the public as the moment the royal family finally, truly, became human in the eyes of the nation. The mystique of the crown was not shattered by the collapse in the picture gallery, it was transformed. It was replaced by something stronger, more resilient, and more relatable, the mystique of enduring love. When the public looks at King William, they see the future. But when they look at the photographs of an elderly Charles walking slowly with a cane beside his wife in the Scottish Highlands, they see the heart of the institution. They see the proof that beneath the ermine and the gold, there beats a human heart, capable of making the hardest choice of all. What do you think? Was King Charles right to abdicate the throne to care for Camilla, or should he have invoked the Regency Act and remained king in name while William handled the duties? Does a living abdication weaken the mystique of the monarchy, or does it modernize and humanize it in a necessary way? How will history judge the reign of King William V, knowing it began not with a death, but with a medical crisis and a father's sacrifice? And what does Camilla's collapse and Charles's subsequent exit tell us about the physical and psychological toll of a lifetime of royal service? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and this story, more than any we have covered, demands the community's judgment. If you want to stay ahead of the royal stories the mainstream media won't touch, make sure you are subscribed to turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the heaviest crowns are not made of gold and diamonds, but of duty and sacrifice. Because in the House of Windsor, the crown passes by law, but the heart passes by choice. And the choice is the Charles. The choice is the Camilla. The choice is the collapse. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.